a loan officer at my own bank, a young man who couldn't have been older than 30, looked at my application, looked at my birth date, and then looked back up at me with an expression I recognized immediately, because I'd spent years wearing a version of it myself in board meetings, the polite professional face people make right before they tell you no in the gentlest possible language. He said, "Miss Davis, I just want to make sure you've really thought this through at this stage of life." I was 68 years old. I had a business plan on the table between us that I'd worked on for 4 months, spreadsheets I'd built myself, projections I'd stress-tested against every worst case I could imagine, and none of it mattered in that moment. Because at this stage of life had already answered the question for him before he'd finished reading a single page. I didn't get the loan. I want to tell you that up front, because this isn't a story about a bank finally saying yes. I drove home that afternoon and sat in my driveway for a long time before I went inside. Not crying exactly, just sitting with a very specific, very familiar feeling. The feeling of being told, politely and definitively, that I'd missed my window, that whatever I was hoping to become next, I should have become it decades ago, and that 68 was an age for winding down, not opening up. I believed him, if I'm honest. I believed him for almost a year. My name is Barbara, and I spent 36 years as a certified public accountant in Cincinnati, Ohio. Most of them at a mid-sized firm downtown where I eventually made partner, which in the world I came up in, for a woman of my generation, was its own quiet act of defiance. I married young, at 23, to a man named Gary, and we had our daughter Michelle 2 years later. Gary left when Michelle was 6, for reasons that don't much matter 39 years on, and I raised her alone on an accountant's salary that was, in those early years, considerably smaller than it would eventually become. I want to be clear that I'm not telling you this as a sad story. I'm telling you because I think you need to understand what 36 years of careful, responsible, numbers-driven living does to a person. Especially a woman who started that life with almost nothing and built something solid out of pure stubbornness. It makes you very good at spreadsheets. It also, I've come to understand, can make you very good at postponing yourself. There's a particular kind of woman my generation produced a great many of, and I think I was a fairly typical example. We were taught, gently but thoroughly, that responsibility came before wanting, that the wanting itself was a little suspect, a little indulgent, something to be managed rather than pursued. I built an entire career and raised a daughter largely alone by being the person in the room who could always be counted on to make the sensible choice. I don't regret that woman. She kept the lights on. But she also developed a very specific habit over 4 decades of looking at anything that resembled a personal desire and quietly filing it under later. A folder that, I eventually noticed, had been growing for almost my entire adult life without ever once being opened. Here's what I'd postponed for nearly 4 decades. I wanted to paint, not as a hobby, not as something to putter at on weekends, but seriously, the way I'd wanted it at 19, before Gary, before Michelle, before the mortgage and the tax season, and the 36 years of other people's numbers. I'd taken exactly 1 painting class in my entire adult life, a 6-week evening course when Michelle was in high school, and I still remember the specific, uncomplicated joy of standing at an easel for 2 hours a week, a joy I quietly folded up and put away when the course ended, because there was always something more urgent that year, and the year after that and the 20 years after that. I retired at 66, and for the first 18 months, I did what I think a lot of us do, which is fill the space where work used to be with a slightly frantic assortment of activities that never quite added up to a life. Book club, volunteering at the library. A grandchild in Columbus I visited more than was probably necessary, if I'm being honest with myself about why. And underneath all of it, a low, persistent hum of a question I didn't have language for yet. which was some version of, is this it? Is this the whole rest of my life, arranged around other people's schedules and small pleasant errands, with the painting I'd wanted since I was 19 still folded up somewhere I couldn't quite reach? It was in that 18th month that I decided, almost on a whim, to try turning the wanting into an actual plan. Which is how I ended up in that bank office in the first place. 4 months of business plan work behind me, imagining something modest, a small rented studio space back in Cincinnati, where I might teach evening painting classes, and finally, take my own work seriously enough to build a little practice around it. I'd priced out the lease. I'd talked to a woman who ran a similar studio 2 neighborhoods over, who'd been generous with her time and her numbers. I walked into that bank feeling, for the first time in a long time, genuinely hopeful about something that belonged entirely to me. I walked out feeling like I'd been quietly, politely informed that hope itself had an age limit I'd already exceeded. It was Michelle, actually, who first mentioned Mexico, almost in passing, after a friend of hers had visited Puerto Vallarta and come back with photographs of a neighborhood called Zona Romántica. Cobblestone streets climbing up from the beach, galleries tucked into old buildings, an entire community of working artists who seemed to just exist there, painting in the open air, selling their work at weekly art walks that had apparently been going on for decades. I looked at those photographs for a long time. I didn't say anything to Michelle about the bank, or the loan officer, or the specific shape of what I'd started quietly imagining. I just said it looked beautiful, and let the conversation move on, while some part of me had already, without my full permission, begun to plan. I flew down alone for a week that spring, told everyone it was a vacation, which was true in the sense that a vacation was the only category I trusted myself to admit to. I spent that week walking the Zona Romántica every single day, watching the art walk on Wednesday evening, where a dozen galleries opened their doors at once and the whole neighborhood filled with people moving from one to the next, wine in plastic cups, artists standing beside their own work, talking with anyone who stopped. I struck up a conversation with a painter named Alejandro, maybe 50, who'd been showing at the same gallery for 11 years, and I asked him carefully, testing the words out loud for the first time, whether it was too late for someone my age to seriously start painting. He looked at me the way you look at someone who's asked a question you find genuinely strange, and said, "Too late for what? The paint doesn't check your birth certificate." I laughed, but I also wrote that sentence down on a napkin the moment I got back to my hotel room, because I think some part of me needed it in writing. I came home from that trip and did what I do with everything, which is build a spreadsheet, except this time the spreadsheet wasn't for a business loan. It was for me. Cost of living in Puerto Vallarta. What I could actually afford on my pension and Social Security without touching my savings. The price of a small rented casita in or near the Zona Romántica. Art supplies. Spanish classes. I ran the numbers a dozen ways, and every single time, the number that came back wasn't the number that mattered. What mattered was a sentence I kept writing at the bottom of the page, over and over, in different words each time, which was some version of, "I am not asking anyone's permission for this one." I told Michelle over dinner about 6 weeks later, expecting resistance, bracing for it the way I still, apparently, braced for most things. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mom, you've been telling me about your accounting clients' retirement dreams for 30 years. When do you get one?" I hadn't expected that. I'd expected worry, or at minimum the same polite, careful skepticism the loan officer had shown me, dressed up in daughterly concern instead of banking language. Instead, she asked when I was leaving, and whether she could help me pack. I moved to Puerto Vallarta 8 months after that dinner, at 69 years old, into a small casita 4 blocks from the beach, in a building with a rooftop terrace and a landlady named Guadalupe who ran a small tortilleria on the ground floor and adopted me, within the first week, with the specific, unasked for thoroughness I'd come to learn is fairly common there. I brought 2 suitcases, a set of paints I'd bought at an art supply store in Cincinnati the week before I left, and a fear, still very much alive underneath the excitement, that I'd find out the moment I actually sat down at an easel again that the loan officer had been right all along. That whatever window I'd had for this had genuinely closed. My first week of painting alone in that casita was, honestly, a small disaster. My hand had lost whatever fluency it once had. The colors didn't do what I remembered colors doing. I sat in front of a blank canvas on my 3rd day and cried, not delicately, real ugly crying. Because I'd built this entire 2nd chapter of my life around a version of myself I wasn't sure I could actually locate anymore. I thought about calling Michelle. I thought about the loan officer, and how satisfying it would have been to prove him wrong cleanly and quickly. And how instead I was sitting on a rented floor in a foreign country, with paint on my hands, and absolutely nothing to show for it yet. What got me through that week, and I think this matters, wasn't some sudden burst of confidence. It was Alejandro, the painter from the art walk, who I'd exchanged emails with since that first trip. I told him, honestly, that I thought I'd made a terrible, expensive mistake. He wrote back something I've thought about often since. He said painting isn't a skill you either have or don't have at a certain age. It's a relationship you either maintain or let go cold. And mine had simply been sitting untouched for 40 years. And 40 years of cold doesn't undo itself in 3 days. He invited me to sit in on a weekly life drawing session he ran out of his studio. Mostly local artists, a handful of expats, all skill levels, no pressure, just people showing up to draw together on Thursday evenings. I went, terrified, expecting to be the obviously worst person in the room, which I mostly was at first. Nobody seemed to notice or mind. A woman named Rosa, maybe 60, who'd been drawing there for 6 years, sat next to me my 2nd week and, without making a production of it, showed me a few things about how she held her pencil, how she looked at negative space instead of outlines. I kept going, every Thursday for months. My hand came back slowly, the way I understand now it always does. Not through talent revealing itself, but through simple, unglamorous repetition. The same way I'd once learned to read a balance sheet by staring at hundreds of them until the pattern stopped hiding. The Thursday group became, without my quite planning it, the actual center of my new life. There was a retired architect from Toronto named Frank, who'd been drawing there for 9 years and never said much, but always positioned his easel near mine, which I eventually understood as its own quiet form of friendship. There was a young Mexican art student, Ximena, studying at the university in Guadalajara during the school year, and home in Puerto Vallarta for holidays, who corrected my Spanish patiently and without condescension, the way you correct someone you've already decided to like. Rosa and I started meeting for coffee on Tuesdays, separate from the group entirely, and within a few months I realized I hadn't checked my phone for messages from home nearly as compulsively as I had those first frantic 18 months of retirement. Because for the first time in longer than I could remember, wherever I currently was felt sufficient on its own terms. I also enrolled, that same fall, in Spanish classes 3 mornings a week with a teacher named Profesora Ibarra, who ran a small school out of a converted house 2 streets from my casita, and who informed me, on my very first day, that she had taught retirees from 22 to 91 years old, and that my particular worry, that I was somehow too old for new vocabulary to stick, was, in her professional opinion, nonsense dressed up as wisdom. I believed her more than I believed myself most days, which turned out to be exactly the arrangement I needed. By my 6th month, I had a small body of work I was genuinely proud of, mostly watercolors of the neighborhood, the tortillera downstairs, the specific slant of afternoon light on Guadalupe's courtyard wall. Alejandro, without asking me first, mentioned to the owner of his gallery that a new painter she should meet was living 4 blocks away, and I found myself, less than a year after sitting in that bank office being told to reconsider my life at this stage, standing in a small gallery in the Zona Rontica with 6 of my own paintings on the wall for the weekly art walk, wearing a blazer I'd brought from Cincinnati specifically because some old accountant instinct insisted I needed to look presentable. I sold 2 paintings that first night to a couple from Vancouver who asked kindly how long I'd been painting. I told them the truth, which was either 49 years or 8 months, depending on how you counted, and they laughed and said that was exactly the right answer. Alejandro found me near the end of the evening, after most of the crowd had thinned toward the next gallery down the street, and told me, in the same unbothered tone he'd used that first afternoon on the art walk, that he'd known within about 10 minutes of that first conversation that I'd be standing exactly where I was standing eventually. He just hadn't known it would take less than a year. I asked him how he'd known. He said he'd met a lot of retired professionals who wanted to paint as a hobby, something gentle to fill an afternoon, and a much smaller number who wanted it the way I clearly had, like something unfinished that had been waiting, and that the second kind, in his experience, almost always got there. Rosa and Ximena came to that opening too, along with Frank, who bought nothing but stood in front of the courtyard watercolor for what felt like a genuinely long time before telling me, in his usual economy of words, that it was good. From Frank, I'd learned by then, that was practically a toast. If any of you are sitting with your own version of that loan officer's voice, telling you it's too late to start whatever you've been quietly postponing, I want you to comment below and tell me what it is, because I read every single one, and I think a great many of us are carrying around a specific unfinished thing we've simply stopped believing we're allowed to finish. I've been in Puerto Vallarta for a year and a half now. I show new work at that same gallery roughly every other month, nothing that's replaced my pension as an income. And I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters more than any success story would. I'm not telling you I became a famous painter at 69. I'm telling you I became a painter again, period. Which turned out to be the actual thing I'd been missing. Not the income, not the recognition, just the relationship itself, restored, my monthly expenses here, the casita, groceries, Spanish lessons, art supplies, come to around $1,750, comfortably within what my pension and Social Security cover, with enough left that I finally, at 69, bought myself a proper easel instead of the folding one I'd been making do with. Michelle visited in the fall, stood in front of the watercolor of Guadalupe's courtyard hanging in my casita, and got quiet in a way I recognized. Because it's the same way I go quiet when something lands somewhere I wasn't quite braced for. She said, "Mom, I don't think I ever really knew you wanted this." I told her I hadn't fully known it myself, not clearly, not until I was standing in a bank office being told I was too old for it, which turned out to be the exact moment the wanting became impossible to keep folding up and putting away. She stayed a week, came to the Thursday drawing group with me one evening, sat next to Frank's empty easel and produced, by her own cheerful admission, an extremely bad drawing of a ceramic pitcher, and laughed about it the way I think I needed her to, without the careful concern I'd been bracing for since that first conversation about Puerto Vallarta over dinner. On her last night, we sat on my rooftop terrace, the ocean visible in a thin, dark strip past the rooftops, and she asked me whether I regretted the years I hadn't painted, whether I felt cheated out of them. I thought about that honestly before I answered, because it deserved an honest answer. I told her I didn't, actually. That those 36 years had built the exact stability that let me take this particular leap without terror about the money, and that Gary leaving and raising her alone had made me stubborn in ways that turned out to be useful decades later. In a bank office, and then, more importantly, in a rented casita staring at a blank canvas. Every version of me, I told her, even the tired accountant one, had been necessary to get to this rooftop. I still think about that loan officer sometimes, not with the bitterness I might have expected to still be carrying, but with something closer to a strange, specific gratitude, because I think I needed to hear someone say the sentence out loud, at this stage of life, before I could recognize how much of my own life I'd already been saying it to myself, quietly, for decades, without ever putting it in those exact words. He didn't stop me. He accidentally handed me the sentence I needed to finally argue with. I thought I was too old to start over. I want you to know that thought was real and reasonable and shared by nearly every woman I've met here who arrived carrying some version of it. What I know now, standing in a small gallery in Puerto Vallarta with paint permanently under my fingernails again after 40 years, is that starting over was never actually about age. It was about whether I was willing to sit in front of a blank canvas long enough to be bad at something again. At 69. In front of people, without that being the whole story. Alejandro was right. The paint really doesn't check your birth certificate. It only ever checks whether you showed up. I'm Barbara Davis. Thank you for listening to Women Choose Mexico.